Hello, I'm Irina Bokas. Welcome to the Future of Learning. Henry Ford, a great innovator of his time, said over 100 years ago, thinking is the hardest job there is, which is probably why so few engage in it. Yet, in the past decade, critical thinking has become a job requirement equivalent of a high school diploma. Everybody wants it, but no degree or diploma can guarantee it. An ability to think critically and independently and problem solve will separate future leaders from followers. In Clarkston, cultures of thinking have become a through line in everything that is done in our schools. But how can the use of thinking routines prepare our children for the future? Ritchhart, and principal investigator for the Cultures of Thinking, Harvard Graduate School of Education, is here today to share his insight on what cultures of thinking have in store for our children. Ron, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me, Irina.
As you probably know, our students, especially the younger ones, are going to live and work in the interconnected global society where the 4 C's, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, creativity, are going to be the most valuable skills. So how do you believe cultures of thinking provide learning opportunities and experiences for our children that will prepare them to succeed in the global world?
Well, you're right that the world is definitely changing and the need for those skills is becoming more important. What we also recognize, though, is that the need for those skills even goes beyond the skills. We need the dispositions. So we want students who not only have the skills of cooperation, but are able to be cooperative and that have that disposition to be cooperative, that have that curiosity, that have the critical thinking disposition. So Cultures of Thinking really looks at how is it that we develop those dispositions. And one of my favorite quotes, the quote that I share with parents and community members constantly, is a famous quote from the Russian psychologist Vygotsky, who said, "Children grow into the intellectual life around them." And that's exactly what we're trying to do with Cultures of Thinking, is to create classrooms, to create schools as a culture in which students can grow into a rich intellectual life, can develop those dispositions that they will need for the future and that will carry them forward.
But when we're talking about a lot of times meaningful learning, a lot of times we think it's just about job and how is it going to be in the work environment. But I think if any parent is asked, what do you want for your child? Most of them will say, I want my child to be happy. And that is going beyond just the work environment. So as far as individuals, how do I fit into this world? How can I contribute? What kind of learning is necessary for that? And in the same token, how is developing of thinking disposition will allow our children to become well-adjusted individuals?
Well, you mentioned happiness, and one of the things that we know about happiness is one of my colleagues, Howard Gardner, talks about happiness, and one way that people define that is as time well spent. Recognizing that our interest, our passion, and feeling that we are really engaged. And when we talk about working, we all want work that makes us feel like it is time well spent, that we're getting meaning out of that. So infusing that purpose from the very beginning in schools, for students to see that school isn't about learning only to take an exam, but learning is something that enriches us, learning is something that carries us forward, learning is something which allows us to pursue our passions. So we want that for our students. And you also mentioned the global aspect, the idea of making globally competent citizens. And that means that we want students who are very action-oriented, that can think about things from other perspectives, other dispositions, thinking about open-mindedness as a disposition, curiosity as a disposition. So having those dispositions that they can begin to look at the world and begin to take action and find their place in it.
All right. But I also know that a lot of times parents and I believe schools alike feel a pressure for our students to perform. And as far as the content goes, it's not going away and it's just growing, it seems like. So if still the quantifiable student achievement is something that we expect from schools, how do cultures of thinking fit with that?
Well, the good news is that there is no contrast between doing well on measures, on exams, and learning to think and developing a culture of thinking. That schools that we work with, both here in Michigan as well as around the world, in Australia, in Europe, throughout the United States, the schools we've been working with, we actually find that test scores go up. So there's no trade-off there. And in comparison, some research by a colleague at Harvard Graduate School of Education, Phil Sadler, showed that some of the things that we do in order to prepare kids for university actually aren't. Found that AP exams actually don't prepare kids for university, particularly in science. Instead, having science classes in the secondary in which kids engage in depth of study of topics is a better preparation for university success than an AP exam. So we all want students to do well, but we want them to do well for the long term, not just for the short term.
I think this is actually one of the biggest issues that a lot of people have in with this, because you can't see thinking, right? You can't measure it. How do I think on that scale? And that's where a lot of questions come. So if student achievement is supposed to increase, then how long is it going to take before we can see it? So do you have any idea how long it might take before you start seeing that kind of curve up?
Well, when we talk about developing a culture of thinking, where we see the most growth is when the principal is a real leader of that culture of thinking, when the teachers are on board, and there's a real commitment. So not just kind of yeah, we'll do a few thinking routines every once in a while. If you give anything lip service, you're not going to see much results. But when schools really work at developing a culture of thinking, they begin to see those results. Most schools have said, 2 and 3 years, we've seen some real results. 5 years on, those results really become very, sustained and very long term.
So takes a couple of years.
It does. It's not a quick fix or a quick bullet. And oftentimes in education, particularly in the United States, we're kind of sold, well, what's the thing to do right away to raise test scores this year?
Yes.
And that's a very, very short-term focus. And instead of focusing on the short term, thinking about the long-term preparation, that as we get students who are used to learning, used to thinking, used to developing understanding, that has real payoffs.
Well, when we're saying learning how to think, it seems like a very abstract idea, because thinking, you can't really touch it, you can't put your finger on it, it's very individualized. And if this is the case, if thinking is very individual and personal, how can it be taught or learned?
Well, of course our individual thoughts are individual, but thinking is a process. And we learn processes all of the time. So, for example, making connections. We can teach kids to make connections, reasoning with evidence, considering different perspectives. So all of those are things that we can teach. We can teach those processes. We often talk about that in psychology as the meta-strategic knowledge, the strategies that students have at their disposal to develop their thinking and understanding. And we can work on those. So those we actually have made quite visible.
And I also see a lot of times in the schools, you can actually see the thinking through obviously, making thinking visible.
Yeah, so the use of thinking routines, when teachers ask questions, when parents ask a question, simple question of what makes you say that begins to make that thinking visible.
But I also believe that cultures of thinking is not the destination. It's a tool, it's the beginning, is the first step to something a little bit larger, which is a culture of thinking. And what does it mean really for students in community in general, or schools for this matter, to become a genuine thinking culture?
Well, the way that we define what a culture of thinking is, we say that it's a place. So it doesn't have to be a school, doesn't have to be a classroom, but a place, any time where a group of people come together, where learning is a part of what they do, we have the opportunity to create a culture of thinking. And in that culture, that means that in that group, that place, it means that the group's thinking as well as the individual's thinking is valued, that it's visible, and that it's actively promoted as part of the regular day-to-day experience of all of those group members. So when we work on those 3 key actions, making sure we value thinking, making sure that, not just saying, oh, of course we value thinking, but what kind of thinking are important in, say, history or in science or in math or in art. making that very clear to students, the kind of thinking that it takes to do well in that discipline, to understand that discipline, then making it visible, and then actively promoting that thinking. So all students come to us with abilities to think, and we want to make sure that we are pushing them, that we are challenging them, and that we are getting the best out of them.
Well, with connection to that, I do have another question regarding the environment. A lot of times we hear that students just don't provide enough opportunities for individual learning, especially for students who are maybe ahead of the group or behind. So from this perspective, how is the environment, a thinking classroom, which is really accomplished or created by the ongoing use of the thinking routines, allows for individual learning as well as collective learning?
Well, in creating a culture of thinking in any group, one of the key forces behind that are the opportunities we create. And when we talk about the opportunities, we want to have, I use the metaphor of a room. So we want the idea of those opportunities to have a low threshold, so can all students enter into this problem space to talk about these ideas, to talk about this content, to begin to explore that. So having a low threshold, but we also want to make sure it has a really high ceiling. And that means that there's the opportunity to explore and to push oneself as far as possible. And then keeping with that metaphor of a room, we also want to make sure that it has wide walls. And that means there's an opportunity to explore and spread out in depth. And when we create those kinds of opportunities with a low threshold, high ceiling, and wide walls, then we're really able to differentiate instruction and allow students to take things as far as they might go. We run into problems when we view teaching as only the delivery of content, because then if students know the content, then what do we do? But when it's about the engagement with ideas, then the sky's the limit.
Yes, I do believe so, because especially a lot of times we do learn the content, but we don't know what to do about it. And how it's applied to the real world is probably more important than anything else. Well, thank you so much again for this conversation today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And as far as thinking and as far as learning in Clarkson Community Schools, we live in the world where information is really readily available. Finding the answer is not the problem. The problem is that our students sometimes can read, but they don't think like readers. They can write, but they don't think like writers. They can listen, but they don't think like listeners. They learn content, but they don't connect it to the real world. A culture of thinking builds a bridge that allows the existing knowledge today become what it can possibly be in the real world. What felt just like a great innovation 4 years ago, today is a normal part of our schools. And in fact, it is the culture of our children.